Hi, I am Sergei Putnov, a 22-year-old Ukrainian currently enlisted in the military to defend our nation against foreign aggression in the Russo-Ukrainian War that began in February 2022. I had started my studies in agri-food engineering, inspired by my father, a prominent agricultural producer in Mykolaiv. But duty called, transforming my aspirations into resistance. My battlegrounds are now the very fields I once dreamed of cultivating, and my commitment is an extension of my father's legacy. With unwavering determination, I stand alongside comrades who share the same cause, ready to safeguard our identity and country with an unshakable faith in a future of peace and reconciliation. Like many young Ukrainians, and probably Russians as well, I was swept into the whirlwind of war that, sooner or later, seemed inevitable due to the political and geopolitical negotiations between our two sister nations, each with vastly different visions of the future. Instead of criticizing the conflicting parties, I aim to share my personal story and impressions of this fratricidal war, along with my unforeseen military career. All of this hijacked my childhood and thrust me abruptly into the realm of responsibilities, without any transition. So, my words will reflect the perspective of a naive young person who, deep down, believes in the prevention of any war. Unfortunately, history has demonstrated otherwise. For months now, our country's partners have been issuing alerts about the abnormal buildup of Russian troops at our borders. Naturally, accustomed to such threats, I expected it to pass without difficulties, much like many fellow compatriots. However, a portion of our territory, controlled by separatists, had long been supported by Russian military and paramilitary forces. Due to our Soviet past, we Ukrainians didn't interpret the alarm bells in the same way. Some support Russia, nostalgic for its Soviet history, while others are less inclined, and many have been opposing it since the revolution in our country. As for me, I struggled to grasp the engineering courses, which, I must admit, weren't easy. Nevertheless, with the passion I had for the agricultural field and the support of my father, things were going well. It should be mentioned that, like many young individuals without major concerns for daily sustenance, I had little interest in politics and the negotiations for or against Russia. At the institute where I was studying, the topic was on everyone's lips. Personally, I preferred to escape into my thoughts, dream about future successes, listen to American music, and immerse myself in my notebooks whenever I had the chance. Not much of a talker, I saw life as a miracle to be savored, avoiding getting caught up in frivolities like war. I had a girlfriend, Alexia, who shared the same worldview as me, and with whom I would venture into whimsical daydreams. However, February 24th, 2022, would mark the turning point that would alter our perspective on life. Under the pretext of protecting Ukrainian Russians and eradicating alleged neo-Nazism, Putin declared war on my country. A war he ironically named Special Military Operation. Swiftly, our government took necessary measures to counter the advance of Russian troops toward the capital. There was no longer a question of letting things unfold as they had in the past. This is how I found myself within the ranks of the military, as if I had missed a chapter of my life. I often wonder if war couldn't take a different form. After all, aren't the leaders who detest each other the ones who should face off? Instead of plunging civilian populations, who hold no grievances against one another, into conflict and sowing the deadly seeds of discord. In any case, in the current scenario, I am the one who must go to the front lines and follow the orders of leaders to kill other soldiers, other young Russians who don't understand why they should be fighting for the supposed greater interest of their nation, which is not threatened at all. Ultimately, it must be acknowledged that this stems, once again, from a history of leaders unwilling to cooperate as partners. The declaration of war triggered a migratory wave, especially among women and children, to regions not immediately threatened or outside the country. This is how Alexia ended up in Poland. As for my parents, they chose to stay in Mykolaiv to protect the production and the family-owned factory. Was this an error? The future didn't take long to tell us. It's been 3 months since I bid farewell to my family, and here I am now in our military barracks about 30 kilometers from the front. As a conscript, even though we had already completed our military training, we continue to train. Only the regular soldiers are meant to be on the front lines, while we in a way cover their backs. We ensure they have the necessities for combat, including food and care in case of serious injuries. I've seen all kinds of injuries and suffering that they've endured. It must be said that after the failure of the attempt to capture Kiev, the Russians focused more and more on the east and south of Ukraine. The fighting worsened in our vicinity, and our frontline soldiers eventually ceased to retreat until a certain stabilization. At the headquarters of our military detachment, the atmosphere was gloomy, but morale was high. After all, we had to defend the motherland, even if it meant sacrificing the sons of the nation. We were fighting for the freedom to live. Interestingly, it was the same sentiment motivating young Russians, the survival of historic Russia. But my question remained, wouldn't we be freer if each person stayed in their own country, cultivated love for their neighbor and brother, and abandoned the inclinations for war? Could we not rather sacrifice our senseless pretensions for peace and freedom instead of sacrificing the sons and daughters of our nations? However, history has always taught us that those who seek peace, and by extension freedom, must prepare for war. We hadn't foreseen the catastrophe at our main military base where I was stationed. On that day, around 3 o'clock in the morning, a missile struck us, causing the deaths of many of us in our sleep. I miraculously survived without injury, but for the first time, I faced death, finally, the deaths of my comrades en masse. Rescue operations saved what could be saved. But a much harsher blow was going to plunge me into depression. In this wave of bombings across Ukraine, Mykolaiv wasn't spared either. Since that day, I became an orphan due to the bombing of our family home. On that day, I understood that life is made up of happiness, misery, and heart-wrenching separations. No one is immune to life's ups and downs. The challenge is to accept them, to get used to the difficulties in such a way that they don't have too much impact on the balance of our existence. But could I ever restore the balance of my life? I had already lost it. Dazed, I still tried to think. I no longer understood. To find myself in the midst of all this? Dream, reality, no, truly, I will never know where these two things separate. Maybe I'll try to grasp my reality in this chaotic world where everything clashes. Perhaps later, when I muster the courage. For now, I give up on contemplation. I don't want to torment myself anymore. For those who expected me to recount rather adventurous feats, that won't be the case. In fact, in times of war, the small victories, daring and successful actions are meant to boost the morale of the troops. However, one becomes insensitive to all of that through constant fighting, especially when one has experienced the horror of war. For almost 6 months now, I no longer know where to turn. I've lost my parents and all the agricultural assets that my father owned. Alexia and I have finally broken up. It's astonishing, she can't bear my absence and no longer wants to live in the anxiety of not knowing if I'm alive or not. Life can truly be generous to certain people, I believe. It all hinges on chance, on being affected or not by an insignificant event. Before being redeployed to the risky zone of Bakhmut, I have the time to take a break and return to the family home, which now only includes me, in order to gather and protect what's left of my life. I've contemplated deeply on everything happening around me, but honestly, I haven't come to any significant conclusions. As for military accomplishments, yes, the Ukrainian army, long in a defensive stance, shifted to an offensive in the summer and autumn of 2022, and the victory in certain regions was resounding. Russia suffered a setback that reverberated around the world. Kherson and Kharkiv were partially liberated, but the Russian occupiers weren't defeated. They lost battles, but not the war. I was in the Kherson Army Division during that lightning counteroffensive, facilitated by the fact that under pressure, Russian forces began to retreat from the left bank of the Dnieper River. I was on the front lines, and it was the first time I took the life of an enemy. It's very difficult to come to terms with, to see myself ending someone's life, even if it's the enemy in times of war. But it's either you or them. Now, we find ourselves on the Bakhmut front, where the most violent battle since World War II is taking place. Before this, there was the Battle of Mariupol, followed by the one in Lysychansk. Both armies inflicted immeasurable fatal blows upon each other. We regularly carried out reconnaissance missions to counter those of the Russian troops, particularly the formidable Wagner forces. Their losses don't seem to affect them. At the beginning, we had the advantage of controlling the strategic points of the city, allowing us to neutralize the approaching Russians. However, for how long? We were losing and recapturing our positions, but at what cost? I would say at the cost of losing our fellow fighters and our means of fighting, much weaker and feeble in comparison to the Russians. I was fortunate to survive several situations where death seemed inevitable. This taught me that life, although chaotic at times, offers us mitigating circumstances and unexpected hopes, perhaps to prepare us for even tougher trials. In any case, death was our daily companion. It's what drove us to remain determined to defend the city and show the world that the smaller can triumph over the greater if determination is present. It's the very essence of the struggle we wage as Ukrainians. But was it worth it? This was also the question that constantly resurfaced in the minds of fervent Ukrainian defenders and many observers of this war. Today, I finally have the time to reconsider my life as a student, dreaming of success in the agricultural field that my father bequeathed to me, and as a soldier for almost a year. Indeed, I can't deny it, as I am currently hidden in a building towards which the Russians are rapidly advancing. I am trapped and waiting. Perhaps our troops will be able to carry out evacuation operations, and perhaps life will grant me a new chance. Or perhaps the Russians will take me hostage and, in the worst case, kill me. In any case, I've had my share, and I remember this history lesson: peace at any cost, war forever. Let's unite our forces so that conflicts, which always stem from disagreements between leaders, are avoided at all costs in the world, as their repercussions are catastrophic for innocent civilian populations. I will conclude with these words: Slava Ukraini.